Alright, hi everyone, how's it going? Welcome to another video. Now, I want to do a video on something I watched recently. Due to the lockdown, I've been watching some series, binge watching certain series that I hadn't seen. Been watching some movies more than I ordinarily would watch. And something really caught my attention, and I thought it would be worthy of a video to kind of talk about this. I was watching a series recently that Vice has put out called The Dark Side of the Ring. I don't know if any of you have seen this, but The Dark Side of the Ring is kind of about the dark side of the professional wrestling industry, particularly WWE, or what used to be called WWF. So I was watching those. I kind of binge watched that. I found that to be pretty interesting. I was a pretty big pro wrestling fan at one time. I haven't really watched too much of it in a long time now. I probably stopped watching around 2001 or 2, and only on occasion will I maybe turn it on to see what's going on. There haven't been really too many pro wrestlers in recent years that have really kind of impressed me as having like unique gimmicks, or having something I thought was unique. The last one I could think of was Bray Wyatt, and that's already going back a few years. I thought he had a pretty unique gimmick. But anyways, I'm watching this Dark Side of the Ring. I mean, there are, certain things on pro wrestling that I do like to listen to. For example, I mean, there are a couple podcasts. I like the Chris Jericho podcast, but I mostly listen to hear the interviews with like rock guys primarily. There's also the Jim Cornette one, which I listen to, and there's Great North Wrestling or Hannibal TV, which is a YouTube channel that I listen to. And yeah, it's kind of interesting. I guess like Hannibal, who has this YouTube channel, his YouTube channel has actually gotten more views, from what I understand, within the past month than all of SmackDown. So the ratings of WWE have been pretty low. I mean, they used to be very high. I think they were like 8 ratings. Now I think it's like 0.08. So they've really gone down a lot. Not as many people watching. I think there could be a number of reasons for this. I mean, I even question and wonder how many people are even watching cable TV now. For one, I mean, that could be part of it. I don't know, but yeah, it has declined in popularity quite a bit in recent years. However, there are other things I will watch and listen to in regards to pro wrestling, because I find some of the shoot interviews and the podcasts to be interesting, because some of the best stories in pro wrestling are a lot of that like behind the scenes kind of stuff. The kind of stuff like you don't even see when you watch a wrestling program. Like the behind the scenes, the road stories about, life on the road and getting to places, and just all the things that have happened that are not part of the wrestling show, or things that were a part of the wrestling show that were kind of hidden that you didn't know about. This Dark Side of the Ring show definitely gets into all of that. But one Dark Side of the Ring in particular, really caught my attention, and it was the episode on the Brawl for All. I don't know if any of you remember the Brawl for All. Brawl for All happened in 1998, and they get into all this. And what it was the pro wrestlers were going to have kind of an MMA style or tough man type contest. Now you have to understand, the UFC and MMA at this point, it was around, but it was really in its infancy, and it was kind of circling the drain at this time. There were a lot of articles coming out about the UFC, calling it human cockfighting and all that, and it was really in danger of going under. This was before Dana White had bought it. Vince McMahon, shortly after the Brawl for All, from what I understand, was offered was asked if he wanted to purchase the UFC, and he said no. And the reason why he said no is because he didn't want to own an organization where he couldn't control who the superstar was. He wanted to be in control of who the superstar is. If you think about it, like in MMA, you'll have someone like Chuck Liddell, and he's a big star, then he loses, and then they'll find another star. They'll have someone like Ronda Rousey, then she loses. So Vince McMahon wanted a situation where he could always control who the superstar was. And you could do that in pro wrestling. But anyways, there was this event called the Brawl for All, happened in 1998. And it was essentially like a tough man contest. They had rules. Rules were kind of strange, and it almost didn't seem like they were really that well thought out. It was like, you get 5 points if you get a takedown on a guy, and you would get another, like, I think it was just a point if you punched if you hit the guy with a hit. I don't think kicks were allowed. I do remember watching this, and yeah, I can't remember. Don't think kicks were allowed. But yeah, so those were the rules. And like I said, the rules didn't seem like they were well thought out. The people judging it didn't have experience in judging this kind of thing. The whole thing happened, and you find out in this documentary that the whole thing happened as a result of a pro wrestler named Bradshaw, or JBL as he was called. Apparently, backstage one day, he claimed that he could beat anyone on the WWF or WWE roster in a real fight. That he could beat anyone in a real fight, or what they would call like a shoot fight. He could beat anyone. And Vince Russo, who was like, I believe the head writer at the time, or one of them, said, well, let's see if you can back that up. And then he came up with the idea of the Brawl for All as a means of seeing if Bradshaw was really the toughest guy. He felt he would lose because, as Vince Russo says in this, he's like, I could think of at least 10 guys in the WWE that could beat you. And they decided to have this, like Vince Russo says, let's see who the toughest guy really is in this organization. Let's see who it is. At this point, it had been, Vince McMahon had already come out publicly and, it admitted that pro wrestling was choreographed, a work. And he had already come out, I want to say it was like December of 97. So now they were going to have this match to see, who was the toughest guy. It was a tournament. And you would draw names from the tournament. I remember, there were two guys that were tag team partners. One was Bradshaw, I believe the other was Bob Holly. And they had to have a match against one another. And, there was just, or I don't know. No, I actually want to say it was Bradshaw against, it was Bart Gunn against Bob Holly. That was it. Yeah, Bart Gunn against Bob Holly. Bart Gunn ended up winning. And I remember him saying that created this moment that was like really awkward when they drove back to the hotel they were staying. It was like really awkward because he had beaten his tag team partner, I believe it was his tag team partner at the time. And it created this awkward situation. But anyways, they had this. Now, there was a wrestler at this time, an individual by the name of Dr. Death, Steve Williams. And this was kind of seen as an event that could potentially get Steve Williams over and make him a superstar. They brought him in so he could have a feud with the top guy in the company at that time. At that time, it was Stone Cold Steve Austin. They brought him in so he could have a feud with Steve Austin. And, Jim Ross was kind of okay with it. He kind of, yeah, Dr. Death will end up winning this whole thing. So, he was kind of fine with it. It was assumed Dr. Death would win. He was like a top NCAA wrestler. He had the background to win this thing. So I figured, yeah, he'll win it. All-American football player. Should be no problem for him. Well, in combat sports and in fighting, I mean, it could be kind of chaotic. And as you see in the UFC, sometimes the person who's not expected to win ends up being the winner. You see this time and time again in MMA. That's kind of the charm of it, I think, is that, the guy that kind of gets written off as the guy who's not going to win sometimes will be the winner. And that's what happens in these things. So they assumed, due to his background and how he looked on paper, that this Dr. Death was going to win the whole tournament. So then the tournament happened, and, a lot of guys ended up getting hurt in this thing. They ended up with like dislocated shoulders, and they ended up with pretty severe injuries. There wasn't all this information on concussions at this time of CTE. There wasn't a lot of information about that going around at the time. So there was more of a mentality at that time of, if you got like hit in the head hard, there was more of this like, just suck it up and get out there kind of a mindset at the time. And like I said, yeah, a lot of guys did get hurt. I remember specifically there were matches like a boxer, Mark Miro, who was a trained boxer, went up against Steve Blackman, who was another guy kind of favored to win this thing. Guy who had a lot of martial arts experience. And I remember Mark Miro was winning, and then Steve Blackman utilized the takedown to begin getting all these points. And Steve Blackman ended up winning, but then I believe he got injured and he had to leave the tournament, from what I remember. Dan Severn was in this, UFC Hall of Famer Dan Severn. He ended up winning his match. I believe it was against the Godfather, as he was known at the time. He beat him, but then Dan Severn ended up leaving the tournament. I forgot why exactly. There was a reason. And I know Dan Severn has talked about why he did leave. I think he might not have liked the rules or something like that. Because, the guys it wasn't UFC rules, and the guys were kind of limited in what they could do. There weren't submissions. Dan Severn, knew submissions. He couldn't use any of that. So, I guess he didn't want to be in it. Ken Shamrock was asked to be in it. He didn't want to be in it because this kind of thing, if you lose, your brand could kind of get tarnished. And that's what happened to Steve Williams, unfortunately. Steve Williams went in there. He had his match with Bart Gunn. And, Bart Gunn he was a tag team wrestler. I guess he was considered maybe a jobber, maybe a little above a jobber, as they call those guys. He wasn't a superstar. He was like a mid-card wrestler, and was not expected to win this thing. Well, it turned out he had some, pretty good knockout power, and no one suspected that. And he ended up knocking a lot of these guys out. And the match with Dr. Death, Steve Williams, it was like they started grappling. I think Steve Williams took Bart Gunn down. Then Bart Gunn got up. At some point, he took down Steve Williams. Steve Williams, I think, tore his quad. And he got up and he only had use of one leg. Bart Gunn then closed in and ended up knocking Steve Williams out, damaging his career. I mean, that damaged his career because the brand of Steve Williams is now tarnished. Who was going to believe that he was this really bad, tough guy who was going to give Steve Austin a run for his money? No one. And that's the reason why guys like Jim Cornette didn't like this, because it kind of went against some of the rules of the business. I listened to the Cornette podcast, so I do kind of know his philosophy on pro wrestling, and um how he felt on this. Vince Russo, who Cornette does not like at all, had a completely different perspective of pro wrestling. His belief was kind of more like people are not really into pro wrestling, the wrestling itself. They're more into the storylines and the weird personalities, and kind of wanted to make pro wrestling a little more like the Jerry Springer show, and how the Jerry Springer show was at the time. He even admitted it in this documentary. But anyways, yeah, you really saw how this happened. What ended up happening was Bart Gunn ended up winning the tournament, and Bart Gunn ended up ultimately getting he ended up winning the tournament. The winner was supposed to get a match or a feud with Stone Cold Steve Austin, but they didn't give Bart Gunn the push. They didn't allow that to happen for Bart Gunn. Instead, they kind of shelved him for a while, had him do nothing, and then they brought in Butterbean, and they had him have a boxing match with Butterbean. Now, Bart Gunn really wasn't a boxer. He could hit hard, but he really wasn't a boxer. He ended up getting knocked out by Butterbean, and he ended up not getting a push altogether. I always felt like they should have pushed Bart Gunn a little more in this. I felt like he kind of earned it. They should have given him a little more of a push, made him a little bit of a bigger wrestler. I know he was just this mid-card guy, but they should have done more with it. In the end, no one ended up getting over, and what that means is no one ended up becoming a fan favorite star. No one ended up getting over in this thing. It was believed this would get people over. It didn't. So it ended up not really being beneficial to the company as a whole. And that's why it was on this dark side of the ring thing. That's why it was on the dark side of the ring. And I think that's also why Vince McMahon wanted nothing to do with the UFC. Shane McMahon, from what I understand, he wanted Vince to purchase the UFC. Vince was just like, I can't control who the superstar is. I don't want this thing. So, yeah. Interesting to see this Brawl for All. I remember watching it. I remember my dad at the time wanting to see it, because I was a pro wrestling fan at this time, but my dad was not. My dad was a sports fan, but not a pro wrestling fan. So my dad, I remember, took interest in this. He's like, oh, they're actually going to answer the question of, who the toughest guy is. So he got interested in it because of that. I think probably there were some others who did for that reason. But yeah, as a whole, I don't know if it was a great thing. No one ended up getting over in this. No one really ended up getting over as a result of this. So it's interesting to hear kind of the behind the scenes and how the whole thing started, because of, Bradshaw's bragging about how he could beat anyone on the roster in a real fight. And of course, he didn't end up winning. He ended up being beaten by Bart Gunn, from what I remember. In fact, I believe Bart Gunn knocked Bradshaw out pretty quickly, from what I can remember. But yeah, it was just interesting to see this thing, this documentary, Dark Side of the Ring, because I remember this whole event, this Brawl for All, pretty clearly. So I wanted to talk about it. I know, this came at a time when pro wrestling was, a lot bigger than it is today. It was getting these huge ratings at the time. It was probably at an all-time high around that time. I mean, I remember it had really huge popularity. That was the time referred to now as the Attitude Era. That's what they called it. But Yeah, I just wanted to do a video on this. I really brought back some memories of watching this when it happened. And the Dark Side of the Ring is a pretty good show. Like I said, WWE is not putting this out. It's put out by Vice, actually. So that's all I've got. Again, I hope everyone stays safe. If you watched this video, please remember to like and subscribe. Have a good day.